As you may know, a few weeks ago at the annual South by Southwest convention, Sega of America's social media representative Aaron Webber, along with a few other Sega alumni, hosted a presentation meant to clarify the foreseeable future of the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. Amongst Mr. Webber's unquenchable affinity for memes and the hype for Sonic Mania shifting up a couple gears, we got our first piece of substantial information regarding the now indicatively titled Sonic Forces, starting with that name and followed up by our first taste of gameplay. We learned that the game, to pretty much no one's surprise, will continue along the gameplay trends set by Sonic Unleashed and later refined in Sonic Generations. Or at least part of it will. Classic Sonic will be returning, most likely in the same capacity as he was prior, and it's just been revealed that we have a new customizable character to look forward to, but that's not really what this video's about. Anyway, upon confirmation of the now dubbed Boost gameplay returning, many Sonic fans have been quick to exalt their excitement and foment their disdain alike. On the one hand, you have fans saying, hey, awesome, Sonic's going back to what he was doing in 2011. It's good that they're staying consistent. After the whacked out science experiment that was Sonic Lost World, this is the perfect thing to get us back on track. On the other, it's more along the lines of, this gameplay again? Really? I'm sick of this style. It's shallow, boring, and completely flies in the face of Sonic's identity as a platformer. This shouldn't be what defines Sonic in the modern age. These two opposing views are pretty much at odds with each other and, among other praisings and grievances people have expressed, work to make the overall fan reception of Sonic Forces upon deeper inspection tentative at worst and cautiously optimistic at best. Though there are fans absolutely stoked for this game, I've seen more than a few use it as an opportunity to purge their issues with the Boost gameplay and how, comparatively, some of Sonic's older installments are a better fit for the character going forward. Enter the Sonic Adventure games. In the last few years, the adventure games have received a demonstrable lashing in their standing among the Sonic fanbase and the gaming community at large. This has done a lot to galvanize the contingent of the fanbase that still confides in these games who, having their pleas to Sega for a return to this era continually fall on deaf ears, grow more and more restless by the day. In the most extreme case, these fans will go on to argue that the adventure games are Sonic's best foray into 3D, and that the Boost games disregard all of their qualities in favor of something that, even at its best, could never be as good. However, this attitude seems to go both ways. Fans of the Boost games have been quick to retort, saying that the adventure games are archaic, fraught with poor design choices, and don't hold up to their modern incarnations, which are just a more quality style Sega have taken the time to refine. This fandom dichotomy is what's inspired me to make this video. Out of all the gameplay approaches 3D Sonic has picked up and dropped over the years, these two in particular seem to be the big ones that people vouch for and are more often than not very critical of the other side, so I think it's worth comparing and contrasting the two and seeing what we can learn from it. Now, I want to say right off the bat that I don't intend to reveal in this video which of these styles I prefer, as that's not really the point. To me, neither style is perfect or even really ideal. They both have a wealth of elements that serve to bolster the success of 3D Sonic, but also inhibit it as well. You'll have a fair number of people who say that the best option between these two styles would be something in the middle. With this video, I want to try and explore what exactly that means. So without further ado, here we go. Now, in this video, I wanted to mainly talk in terms of gameplay. Story is an element in Sonic, and the ideal execution thereof, I think, is a subject deserving of its own video. Here I want to more or less just cover Sonic Team's different approaches to laying the foundation for 3D Sonic and not overcomplicate things too much. Alright now, brass tacks. The first element I want to focus on is how Sonic controls in these games. Among many things, control is something the Sonic series has struggled with continuously since 1998. It's no surprise, honestly. When you consider the premise of the Sonic franchise, there's just a lot more it has to compensate for than other games of its ilk. Sonic is a platformer, a genre that since its inception has always been about methodical, precise movement. Maybe less so in 3D than in 2D, but that's still the essential essence. Because of which, before you go ahead implementing all their fancy mechanics and whatnot, it's important that the character's base sense of movement is responsive and comfortable. Their walking and running speed, how they turn, the weight of their jump, their weight in general, it should all feel natural, satisfying, and rhythmic in how each action flows into the next. For most platformers, and most games that involve controlling a character, this is a simple undertaking, as the character will typically always travel at a measured pace, about the pace you or I would leisurely jogging, so their mobility only has to account for that. Sonic, however, is also about speed, if you're just joining us. It's a theme of the series, and one that is crucial to influencing the gameplay if it's to be identifiable as its own thing. Sonic goes fast, and that's what you expect to be doing when you play one of his games. But a character designed to move at a moderate pace can't use those same sensibilities for 6 miles an hour to account for 60 miles an hour. There's a big difference between how a Mario feels and how a Mario Kart feels, if you understand. It's this inherent contradiction that makes even controlling Sonic quite the brain-teasing task for designers to wrap their heads around. Sonic's control needs to account for both general mobility that indulges the player's pace, and a high-speed action that makes up the appeal and empowerment of playing as the character to begin with. The adventure games and the boost games are very different in this regard. Let's talk about the adventure games first. Also, in case it's not obvious at this point, I only intend on talking about the Sonic portions that make up these games, as those are pretty much where the meat of this conversation lies. One more thing I want to make clear before I move forward. People often like to include the games from Heroes to 06 as additions to the adventure style, or say that their similarities make this era of the franchise a nebulous mess that doesn't really represent anything. While I agree that games between Heroes and 06 retain some hallmarks of the adventure era, I'd argue that in this respect they're not as definitive, so they're not really worth counting in this conversation. When you think of adventure style control, design, structure, story direction, what have you, you immediately think of the adventure games. I mean, sure, adventure is the name of the game, but it's really only these two games where all of these elements come together. Okay, enough digressing. Between Adventures 1 and 2, there are a few differences in terms of mechanics, but they both achieve the same things in terms of Sonic's overall movement, and at first glance, pretty much everything checks out. Sonic's movement feels very comfortable and responsive in these games. His jump has a good weight to it, his acceleration isn't too fast or too slow, and he has a good, tight turning arc. It feels as though if you put him in any other game aside from the one he's in, he would work generally well going at normal speeds. Another bit of praise I have for these games is that they're the only 3D Sonic games that have honest-to-God wall running physics. In a lot of post-adventure 3D Sonic games, including the boost games, having Sonic run on walls was always done via scripting. Well, minus Sonic Lost World, but we're not talking about that game today. In the adventure games, when you approached a wall with a certain amount of speed, you would run up and along it, and would continue to until you lost speed. It feels totally natural and of your own agency. The problems start to come when the control has to accommodate high speed. When at top speed, Sonic's analog control feels exceptionally sensitive, as if the slightest nudge of the analog stick could send you awry. I think this is a case of Sonic's turning arc not at all being influenced by his speed. When you turn at top speed, you turn just about as tightly as you would going slowly, which to me has always felt really unnatural. It's especially noticeable during certain sections where you're trying to maneuver Sonic through highways and the like, just how jerky he can be. I've had moments where I've ran through these roads in speed highway at top speed and have outright flown off the side of the road straight to my death, since when I've always seen Sonic's speed in the adventure games to be precarious and unreliable. I think in 3D, when Sonic is going fast, he needs more to compensate for that speed than just analog control, otherwise it can result in issues like this. I think it's somewhat telling that from Adventure 1 to Adventure 2, there was an evident effort to make some of the more speed-centric sections of the levels narrower so as to leave you less room to spin out of control. Not to mention times where the speed on display in these levels is entirely out of your control, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Furthermore, the control you have over Sonic's speed in these games doesn't really amount to any more than just holding forward. There are no mechanics Sonic has, maybe besides the spin dash and the homing attack, that do anything to complement his speed or work to the benefit of its control. Most of the ones you do have just feel like additions for addition's sake. They're only ever useful when the design dictates it, which coincidentally enough is seldom when you're going fast. That's not to say they're not good in any way, but, you know. It's perhaps because of these issues that Sonic's speed is never really an interactive constant in the levels you play through. The speed and the platforming in these levels oftentimes feel somewhat separate from each other and don't correlate as seamlessly as they did in the classics, for instance. But again, getting ahead of myself. I'll get more into this when I get to level design. So to go more into the mechanics. The spin dash is a good way of obtaining speed and is fun to use the same way you would in the classics, using it to gain momentum when jumping off inclines, rolling down slopes, the works. But the issues with Sonic's high speed control still apply. The light speed dash? honestly, I've never seen the point of. You use it to fly along a trail of rings. I mean, it can be used as a way of aligning yourself properly when going at high speeds, but in that respect, it's completely situational. It doesn't really add anything, it just kind of acts like a crutch for Sonic's control. Not to mention, in Sonic Adventure 1, you had to charge it up in order to use it, so it was just kind of a pace breaker. The same can pretty much be applied to the Lightspeed attack. In Sonic Adventure 2, they introduced a couple more mechanics, the somersault and the bounce bracelet. The somersault is a totally useless move that does nothing but clutter the control scheme. It's a spin dash with half the spin and none of the dash. The bounce bracelet I actually quite like. It's completely physics-based, so the terrain you bounce off will influence your bounce. It has some variables to it. Unfortunately, the game doesn't really do anything that interesting with it to justify its presence, but I would like to see it come back in some way. If it ever does though, I pray that it won't be mapped to the same button as a bunch of other moves Sonic has like in this game. Yeah, for some reason in Adventure 2, almost all of Sonic's moves, the spin dash, somersault, lightspeed dash, lightspeed attack, and the bounce jump, have all been mapped to one button. It's a really unintuitive setup that often, not always, but often leads to some pretty bullshit deaths. Then there's the homing attack, the mid-air dash Sonic does that homes in on enemies. As a concept, I think the homing attack is necessary for 3D Sonic. Precision in 3D is hard enough, but when it has to be done at high speeds, it can be quite cumbersome without some kind of workaround. However, this particular incarnation is quite archaic. When using the homing attack, there's no way of telling what Sonic is going to home in on. Sometimes even when there are enemies in front of you, it won't home in on anything. You'll just dash forward, completely vulnerable, and end up taking a hit. Finally, there's grinding. In Adventure 2, there will often be rails you can grind on. When on them, you can press a button to accelerate, and you can lean left and right with the analog stick. These things in conjunction with each other can be used to gain speed while grinding. I've never been a big fan of grinding in Sonic games as I feel it feeds into an issue I'll talk about when I get to level design. But its execution here is pretty decent. It's entirely physics-based and feels pretty intuitive. Keeping up speed is entirely about how well you maintain your balance. One annoying issue I have with it though is how you switch between rails. You have to press the jump button in conjunction with tilting the analog stick left or right. It's kind of buggy because depending on the angle you're at when you switch rails, you can end up missing the rail entirely and falling straight to your death. So overall, I'd consider the mechanics in the adventure games to be mostly harmless but generally superfluous. But whereas the adventure games drop the ball in this regard, the boost games pick it right back up. When Sonic Unleashed came out and we were treated to the boost gameplay for the first time, it felt like a special revelation from Sega as they'd finally solved the riddle that had plagued 3D Sonic gameplay for the longest time. Namely, how do you design a game where the player is making Sonic go fast as opposed to watching him go fast? A lot of people accuse the boost gameplay of essentially turning Sonic into a racing game, but honestly, at least in terms of control, I kind of feel like in a way, that's the best case scenario when adapting Sonic's speed into gameplay. Like I said before, there's a big difference between how a Mario feels and how a Mario Kart feels, and through its mechanics, the boost gameplay manages to account for that Mario Kart sensibility. With the addition of moves like the quick step, the drift, and the slide, there's just more that goes into maneuvering Sonic at high speeds than before, so the thrill of seeing Sonic go like the clappers feels like a legitimate gameplay element. Now, yeah, I know that more doesn't necessarily mean better, and in fact, the way these games are designed around their mechanics does expose some of their weaknesses as well as their strengths, but that fundamental idea of giving Sonic more to do with himself when running super fast is solid in its own right. Simple controls may have been Sonic's bread and butter back in the day, but when going into 3D, various things have to be done to account for the complications that third axis brings. Again, it's what makes things like the homing attack a necessity for streamlining the gameplay. And in that respect, I'd say overall, the additions to Sonic's repertoire brought about by this playstyle are worthwhile. To talk about these mechanics more in depth, my favorite one out of all of them is the drift. It's a great idea and perfectly fits as a high-speed maneuver for Sonic to have. It adds some satisfying weight to Sonic's movement and just makes high-speed turning feel a lot more natural than it did in the adventure games. In Unleashed and Colors, it was quite wide, which wasn't an issue at the time, for me at least, but Generations managed to make it a lot tighter and it works great. It feels better and gives you more control, and the animation of Sonic turning into a ball while he does it gives it a nice touch of catharsis and character. The quick step is an okay mechanic, allowing you to essentially strafe while at high speeds. It hasn't really been used in a variety of ways though, only whenever you're stuck on a set path and you have to dodge oncoming obstacles by switching between 3 lanes. The slide is just kind of there. Like the quickstep, it hasn't really been used for anything too interesting, and the existence of the boost kind of eliminates its offensive use. The stomp I quite like. I feel it could be given a bit more in terms of offense, but I like the sense of rhythm you get from stomping to quickly land on a platform and following that up immediately with the boost. It does a good job of keeping things moving. The lightspeed dash is less buggy than it was in the previous games, but it's just as pointless, still being a crutch for Sonic's control that he doesn't even need at this point and is just totally situational. The homing attack I find is a lot better and a little worse at the same time than it was in the adventure games. This time it has an aiming reticule, so it's always made clear which enemy you're about to attack, and it doesn't have a habit of not targeting the enemy properly so that you end up taking a hit. And when it does target them correctly, it doesn't have a habit of missing them entirely and orbiting around the enemy indefinitely. But one little problem I have with it is that when you dash forward without targeting anything, it feels really stiff and unnatural. In the adventure games, when you dashed forward, it was a quick push followed by the resulting inertia carrying you forward. Here you just rocket forward in a straight line and then fall like a rock. It looks bad and it feels bad. Grinding in these games, I feel, isn't as intuitive as in Adventure 2. There's no nuance of trying to balance Sonic to get the optimal level of speed. For one thing, you have the boost, which pretty much annihilates that idea. And another is that grinding sections in these games are designed basically the same as quickstep sections, a linear stretch of terrain comprised of 3 lanes which you switch between to avoid obstacles. With that said though, rail switching in these games has been refined basically to perfection. For one thing, it's not as buggy, there's a designated scripting for it. And another, you switch rails with the shoulder buttons, which gives it a sense of retention considering you also quickstep with the shoulder buttons. And of course there's the issue of the boost itself, the big wild card for people when it comes to their opinion on this gameplay. A move that allows you to barrel through enemies and obstacles and obtain instant speed with the press of a button. While I do personally prefer the spin dash conceptually, I do understand the inclusion of the boost and what makes it fun. It's a means to the same end as the rest of the mechanics in this game, making Sonic go fast as opposed to watching him. When you see him running through loops and corkscrews and the like, the boost makes you feel like you're contributing to that speed. Also, it puts less stress on analog control. When in boost mode, you're already being propelled forward, so at that point you only have to worry about left and right. That being said, I'm not without my criticisms. The problem with the boost is that it has very little sense of give and take. It's an insta-speed button that blows through everything in its way, but its usage has no prerequisite other than having some juice in your boost meter, which is almost never empty. The way it is now, it completely eclipses any potential for other mechanics to have any precedent in this playstyle, especially with how the games are designed around this thing. There's no need to build up momentum to get the optimal level of speed because all the speed you could ever want is one button press away. There's no need to pay attention to oncoming enemies and have your slide attack ready because the boost just takes care of all that for you. As a mechanic, it is rather shallow and overpowered, but that doesn't mean the concept can't be rethought a little to make it a bit deeper, and I certainly don't think it should be thrown out altogether. But in true remedial Sonic Team fashion, the boost gameplay's control, while fixing old problems, manages to create new ones at the same time. With the adventure games, I thought the strength of Sonic's control was his general movement, and his weakness was the mechanics. With the boost games, I feel as though the opposite is true. While Sonic's mechanics make him work like a charm at high speeds, his general movement is just awful. His turning arc is exceptionally wide, making him feel unbelievably stiff, and that's only compounded by his just shy of instant acceleration. His jump's okay, maybe a bit too shallow, but overall it doesn't save him. As the games have progressed, this issue has become less and less severe, but it's still nowhere near where it needs to be. When he isn't boosting, Sonic just feels clunky and uncomfortable in these games. And for a platformer, how a character feels to control can make all the difference. Whatever the case for the controls in the adventure games, clunky and uncomfortable is not what I would describe them as, at least not overall. There's just a severe lack of conventional wisdom when it comes to Sonic's movement in the boost games, and it creates an immediate barrier between the player and the character. In most games, you interact with the game's environment entirely through the character, and if that character feels uncomfortable and uncooperative, it will have an effect on how you perceive the environment. Besides which, this continued oversight only serves to encourage the games to be designed a certain way just to compensate for it, instead of addressing the issue, fixing it, and making everything better as a result. With that said, let's talk about the design, specifically level design. There's an idea about Sonic design that is often propagated by its fans as a code of conduct that every Sonic game ought to stick to, namely that Sonic levels should be designed to facilitate three elements: speed, platforming, and exploration. A level's terrain should accommodate opportunities for fast movement, with platforming challenges that complement said fast movement. They should also give the player the freedom to explore by providing them with an environment where the space between points A and B is more than just a straight line. It gives them the opportunity to use Sonic's speed in experimental, adventurous ways to discover things like power-ups or alternate routes or something, and it feels rewarding and satisfying because it's something you found through thoughtful use of the game's mechanics. To put it more simply, Sonic shouldn't just be about going fast, it should be about what going fast gets you. I don't really want to go any more in depth on this particular subject, as there are folk out there who've tackled it in pretty fantastic detail. If you aren't already familiar, I recommend watching part 1 of a Sonic analysis series called Sonic Spitball, created by a guy called Shaymay. He pretty much hits the nail on the head when it comes to explaining this particular adage. The classic games are basically the gold standard for this code of conduct, and unfortunately, pretty much all of the following installments have adhered to it in fleeting and inconsistent increments. To this day, Sonic Adventure 1 is the closest 3D Sonic has come to fulfilling that classic triad of elements, but even it has its shortcomings. I'll start with the positive. Out of all the 3D Sonic games we've had, Adventure 1's level design is the most open, with some very loose platform and pathway arrangements that at times you can traverse in a way that is quite complementary to Sonic's mechanics and manages to capture some of that exploration through platforming via speed factor of the classics. The best example of this I can think of is the second half of Twinkle Park. After you get off the roller coaster and pass through this bowling section, the level opens up into a series of multi-tiered pathways you can maneuver between at your own leisure as you scale this castle. After successfully jumping past some small tower tops, you come to this narrow platform at an incline. If you spin dash on this incline and follow it up with a jump, the resulting momentum will take you high enough to reach this castle rim, which you can then run along to take a massive shortcut to the end of the level. This is quite similar to a section about halfway through Act 2 of Chemical Plant in Sonic 2. When you take a certain path in this stage, you come up to a speed pad meant to launch you off into a speed section where you run through loops and whatnot. If you jump over the speed pad and do a spin dash jump to the right on this raised bit of road, you'll be able to reach a new area, which is a shortcut that takes you right to the boss, giving you an invincibility power-up and a boatload of rings at the same time. There are moments where Adventure 1 does manage to capture that classic design mentality, but they're just that, moments. While the level geometry feels very open and loose, it's still largely quite linear and exploration doesn't really amount to much. A lot of the time it can just be described as going off the beaten path, looking around for a few seconds and finding an item box. Which is hardly comparable to, say, Sonic 3, where you had levels like Marble Garden and Carnival Night that boasted alternate routes, shortcuts, and secrets in all directions, coupled with Sonic's mechanics that make them a blast to explore in my opinion. Most of the time the levels in this game don't so much feel like open environments where you can indulge as much as they do a series of wide hallways. There are bits and pieces of things to play around with here and there, but you're pretty much just encouraged to go forward. It ends up feeling kind of basic at the end of the day, but it was their first attempt at 3D Sonic. As long as they keep along this design mentality, things should only get better and more developed going forward, right? And I mean, they did, kind of, sort of, in a way. Just not the ideal way. In Adventure 2, the openness and looseness from Adventure 1's level design was entirely absent. The levels had been made much tighter and narrower, giving you less room to indulge, resulting in even less of an explorative edge. While I do think in a way this approach makes Adventure 2's levels more decisive and less wishy-washy than Adventure 1's levels, I feel like it mainly serves to highlight two ruinous trends the adventure game started that have since become a blight on the Sonic franchise. Now, before I continue, I really have to stress that I don't have an issue with linear level design in Sonic games. There's nothing inherently wrong with that approach. My issue with it is less as a concept and more as an overarching design philosophy. I have my fair share of fun with the Sonic and Shadow levels in Adventure 2, but they're definitely a shining example of this philosophy. Anyway, from what I've observed, this linearity epidemic seems to be the result of two game design trends in the Sonic series. The first one is the overuse of bottomless pits. Many of the stages in both Adventures 1 and 2 have you strung along paths that are perpetually suspended above areas of instant death. This approach constricts you to a very specific route and gives you exceptionally little room to play the game your own way. It's one reason why we hardly ever see any levels where Sonic goes underwater, because almost every body of water in a 3D Sonic game arbitrarily results in an instant death. Now again, as a concept, bottomless pits by themselves aren't a problem. They're perfectly welcome in levels such as Final Rush or Skydeck as an element of challenge to add to the stakes at hand. Here they make sense contextually and thematically, but in levels like Emerald Coast, Green Forest, and Windy Valley especially when you consider the beta version, they just serve as an excuse not to have an open level. This trend is a definite issue, but the second one is the bigger of the two. Despite my praises earlier, most stages in Adventure 1, and especially Adventure 2, don't have that flow gained from blending speed and platforming. The gameplay mechanics and platforming challenges don't do a lot to facilitate Sonic's speed and feel like a separate entity from it altogether. Moments where Sonic's speed is put on display are left up to the rather liberal amount of gameplay automation. Things like dash pads, springs, certain grinding sections, certain set pieces, all put there with the intent of making Sonic appear fast and making the levels appear kinetic, but just results in various separate moments where the game essentially plays itself. This is the second ruinous trend started by these games and is a massive hindrance that has plagued the Sonic franchise for years. It is worth pointing out that the adventure games don't have it as bad as some of the games that would follow, and that the classic games themselves did have occasional shades of this type of design. But the difference with the classic games and what the adventure games started is that besides the fact that design like this in the classic games was pretty rare, only ever used in short bursts, your autonomy as a player was never subservient to it. When a speed pad launches you through a series of loops in the classic games, you could technically just not press any buttons during this little sequence, but doing so will still influence what Sonic does. You can still stop in front of a loop and run as fast or as slow as the physics will allow you to. Starting with Sonic Adventure, this same type of set piece will often be completely scripted and/or inundated with speed pads chauffeuring you in the direction the game wants you to go. It would seem as though this is Sonic Team's method of sidestepping the task of designing Sonic's controls to accommodate high speed. Because what's often the case is that for many of these games, Sonic's controls are totally ill-equipped to deal with a lot of the on-screen action, so the game just ends up taking over. You can be guaranteed that on almost any stretch of terrain you come to pass, there will be several dash pads and springs to give you that extra speed you so desire and handhold you through the levels so that you don't spin out of control. This over-reliance on automation also encourages elements that place heavy restraints on the level design. Take for instance some of the big set pieces. These set pieces are a core part of the level design and act as another dictation of how the levels ought to be played. Their presence never allow for the environments to take off in all directions as they have to be designed to compensate these sections. In Emerald Coast, you're always going to be chased by this whale. In Metal Harbor, you're always going to be grabbing this rocket. They force the levels to follow a specific narrative, which is fine if done sparingly, like if it's a transition between different areas of a stage, or between acts like in Sonic 3 if I were to be so ambitious. But when it's used at every turn for the sake of some eye candy, the levels just have no room to breathe. The inherent thrill of discovery through skillful use of a character like Sonic can never truly flourish when it's being kept on such a tight leash by this constant misapplication of spectacle. But old habits die hard, and this misapplication has pretty much become a staple of every game since. With that said, let's talk about the design in the Boost games. I think the level design in the Boost games do a good job of working with the mechanics, as unlike a lot of previous installments, it manages to make Sonic's speed interactive. Sonic's appeal among hardcore players ever since the classic days has always been about honing your skills and reflexes to maintain your speed throughout a given level. The Boost gameplay is basically that concept taken to its logical extreme. The levels still carry that issue of constantly trying to automate the gameplay, but the speed-based mechanics do a bit to mitigate that and make it feel less intrusive. All the mechanics at your disposal in these games work in conjunction with each other to keep up a brisk, fast-paced flow as you use them to maneuver through obstacles that gives off the same initial, adrenaline-pumping vibe you get from any given set piece from the previous 3D Sonic games. And unlike with a lot of those, that vibe never fades away because you're actually contributing to it through gameplay, as opposed to just wading through some flashy vignette to reclaim control of the character you're playing as. I see this as a more refined approach to what Adventure 2's level design was often trying to do. I also think that the level design is kind of an interesting evolution on the speed reward facet of the classic games. It's less about earning speed and more about mastering it. There are two pretty popular arguments people like to throw around when it comes to the Boost gameplay. One being that it offers no challenge, it just has you boost through a series of automatic set pieces where you're just holding one button. I'm sure you've heard the phrase boost to win before. That's essentially what it refers to. Interestingly though, I find that the other complaint people commonly permeate is that its idea of challenge is incredibly cheap. One moment you're running super fast through enemies and obstacles, and before you know it, you're careening off an edge to your death. The challenge comes from knowing when the next sucker punch is coming so you can avoid it accordingly. I can't help but feel these criticisms kind of contradict each other. This boost to win argument I've always contended with. Anyone who's played through Sonic Unleashed can tell you that if all you do is boost your way through the stages, you aren't going to get very far. In fact, playing it that way is pretty much what feeds into that whole "the level design is super cheap" argument. You have obstacles coming at you at a pretty constant rate, spikes, pitfalls, other assorted traps, and you have to react in time if you have a prayer of getting through. The more you play the stages, the more you'll acclimate to the oncoming obstacles, and the faster you'll be able to play it, thus the more you'll be able to maintain use of the boost. Many of the stages in Unleashed and Generations share a lot of traits with stages in Sonic 2 in terms of level design, where you'll have several alternate pathways, and the ones that grant you the most speed are the ones that require the most honing of your reaction time and use of the mechanics. They encourage player improvement for the thrill of Sonic's speed to be truly captured. It doesn't scratch the same itch as the classic game's approach to high-speed platforming, but I think it does a good job carving a niche in that realm. It may not have the nuance of earning speed the way you would in the classics, by virtue of just having an insta-speed mechanic at your beck and call, but it has its own nuance in that, like I said, it's more about mastering the speed the boost allows you. You've been given a gift that you have to turn into a skill. In the earlier levels, you can be a little liberal with it as you're just being shown the ropes, but later levels will often punish you for using it hastily. Through its level design, the game acknowledges that all the speed in the world means nothing if you don't know how to apply it. While the case for the boost games being an equal amount speed and platforming I think definitely can be argued, exploration in these games is undisputedly absent. While the adventure games had somewhat of an issue with straightforward level design, the boost games take this issue to an entirely new solar system. These games clearly wanted to emphasize just how fast and how far Sonic could run, and thus they're completely designed around his speed rather than how you use it. Adventures 1 and 2 definitely encouraged you to go forward with their level design, but in the boost games, you're damned to do otherwise, resulting in level design that is intrinsically linear. You can argue that on an average, levels in Unleashed and Generations have more alternate pathways than the levels in Adventures 1 and 2, but if they do, it's by pure technicality. The game doesn't give you an open environment that you can take in at your own pace. It's instead quite literally reduced to a succession of routes that occasionally diverge. The manner in which pathways branch off each other in these games feels very rigid and overly planned out. There's hardly any wiggle room allowing you to travel between pathways at your own leisure. These games don't let you find your own path, you have to choose the ones they've laid out for you, which, on top of just how fast you're traveling, makes experimenting and exploring a virtual non-entity. Exploration in the adventure games may have been minimal, but it was definitely there to an extent. Now, to Generations' credit, it did have a few instances of relative openness in its level design, like the beginning of Chemical Plant, or quite a few little sections in Seaside Hill actually, and it presents a tantalizing inkling of what level design in this playstyle could be like if its entire modus operandi didn't just consist of gotta go fast. Because the clear focus of this gameplay is the speed, the level design is made more to accentuate the distance between points A and B, rather than the content. While the constant go forward hella fast nature of the design is a definite tip-off, it's only when you stop and look around in these levels that you realize how little the environments, even in Generations, have to offer. You're usually just running past everything anyway, focusing on what's straight ahead, and that's all that pretty much all of these levels are equipped to deal with. This is compounded by the fact that there's nothing in these stages in the way of ring boxes or power-ups like shields, invincibility, or speed shoes to give you any incentive to explore like in the adventure games. It's like the difference between somebody who wants to travel the world to see the sights and experience the cultures, and somebody who wants to travel the world just to say they did it. This is a common argument, and while I agree that this focus on speed creates an absurdly narrow scope for level design, I don't think this approach is necessarily false. I actually think it's quite novel and worth keeping to some degree. Having all these linear sequences where the point solely is to get from point A to B as fast as possible is a good way of complementing the gameplay mechanics, creating interactive set pieces, and accentuating Sonic's role as a speed demon. The problem is that as it currently stands, that's all this gameplay style has to offer. Oh yeah, that too, but I'll get to that in a second. The boost gameplay is designed to be a quick burst of energy with a constant adrenaline all throughout. It's quite apropos if you ask me, there's nothing wrong with Sonic being that. At least in a vacuum there isn't. But you can't design an entire game around this concept, which is pretty evident by every attempt that Sonic Team have made so far. Every time this style has been attempted, it's been done with some kind of arbitrary crutch. With Sonic Unleashed, there was the Werehog. With Generations, there was Classic Sonic. And with Colors... Okay, I wanted to stay impartial in this video, but fuck these 2D sections. These have been a staple of every 3D Sonic game since Unleashed, and they get more and more contentious each time. I mean, what's the point? All they are is a forced, shallow appeal to retro gaming sensibilities with no identity outside of, look, this is 2D, just like Classic Sonic. That means it's good! If I want 2D Sonic, I'll play as Classic Sonic. That's something that's tried and true that everybody knows and understands. When I play 3D Sonic, I expect 3D Sonic, not 3D Sonic that's occasionally 2D for the sake of being 2D. I mean, sure, in Unleashed and Colors, it kind of had a point in that at that time, we hadn't had a console Classic Sonic game in over a decade, but in a post-Generations world where Classic Sonic gameplay, design, and iconography has come back strong enough to make Star Wars look subtle by comparison, and where people's pleas to Nintendo for a Mario game that actually looks new and inspired are finally being answered, 3D Sonic games are still forcing arbitrary amounts of 2D into their gameplay because they understand what the fans want. Well, Sonic Team, in the unlikely event that you see this video, listen up. We don't need this anymore. Stop finding excuses to not improve 3D Sonic. Anyway, sorry. Now, some would argue that this issue of Sonic gameplay having to share space with some unnecessary other playstyle for the sake of padding length has always been an issue, and technically they're right. In both adventure games, besides Sonic, there were other playable characters, all with different styles of gameplay that took up considerable space in the game's runtime. But I'd argue the inclusion of those styles specifically weren't necessarily for padding. Sonic Adventure 1 was the flagship game for the Dreamcast and was kind of viewed as a marketing guinea pig by Sega executives. Among other things, they wanted it to show how many different styles of video games the Dreamcast was capable of executing. That pretty much speaks for itself. Sonic Adventure 2, I feel, was just following in the footsteps of its predecessor and was more concerned with doing that than fiddling around with Sonic's playstyle in particular. Besides which, this whole practice in general is not one that's been received well by Sonic fans, old school fans in particular, and their distaste of it had become pretty apparent by the time Sonic 06 came out. And yet despite that, time after time, even after getting a new, solid, well-received playstyle, Sonic Team is still forcing the obvious standout part of their game, the part they should be focusing all their time on, to lean on some second fiddle side dish that just makes you want more of the main course. And that's because for all its novelty and appropriate application of speed, all the boost gameplay amounts to at the end of the day is one note that, ironically, runs really short. The problem with its focus on constantly moving forward really fast is that, number one, all the levels end up being designed the same way, and bleed together as a result, consisting of the same terrains, obstacles, and set pieces just painted a different color. How many differences can you think of between any of the stages in any of these games besides their aesthetics and music? And besides the 2D sections, because those really shouldn't be there in the first place. And two, all the levels being this one thing would make the game over too quickly. It's pretty evident how much effort goes into making just one of these stages. The amount of assets that need to be built, not to mention rendered in real time as Sonic clears an immense distance of land in a matter of minutes, must burn a pretty big hole in Sonic Team's dev pocket. Not only is every stage in the style a short-lived peak in energy, it's an expensive short-lived peak in energy. These stages aren't that long to begin with, and they can't exactly be mass-produced to fill out the length of an entire game. So it's not exactly hard to see why Sonic Team felt the need to tack on some extra gameplay mechanics to make sure each game with this style had some meat on its bones. Now, you're probably asking at this point, well then what should they do? And to me the answer is quite simple. Just rethink the concept of the gameplay a little bit and make the level design less one-note. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, I won't go into it here as that's not really the point of the video, but I do have a few ideas of what they could do that I'll express in another video sometime in the future. Another game design element I want to touch on real quick is game structure and the different approaches all of these games have to it. They all have some difference in this regard, so I'll go on a case-by-case basis. In Sonic Adventure, when you play through one of the 6 stories, the game drops you into a hub world after being introduced to the character and the conflicts they're subject to in their story. You make your way through the hub world to initiate the cutscenes that further the story and initiate the game's action stages in the sequence they're revealed to you. I think this system works generally well. The hub worlds are charming, fun to navigate, depending on who you are, and do a pretty decent job contextualizing the world the characters exist in. They're kind of pointless in that there's really nothing to do in them and they just kind of feel like a needless buffer between between cutscenes and levels, but they're pretty much harmless. The cutscenes and overall story in the game do a good job giving some purpose and context to each level. You never find yourself asking the questions where and why because it's always apparent and works as a motivation to succeed. In Sonic Adventure 2, you have 3 stories and you go through those 3 stories on a stage-to-stage basis. No hub worlds this time around. There are cutscenes between each stage that further the story of each respective one you pick. Pretty much same applies here as Adventure 1 minus the hub worlds. Sonic Unleashed. More or less the same as Adventure 1 with a few differences here and there. The story doesn't always do a great job giving purpose to the levels you play through. Areas like Empire City, for instance, are completely superfluous to the game's narrative and have no point outside of providing more levels. The hub worlds are better and worse at the same time. They're small and expedient, pretty well packed with actual content that gives them some purpose, and the music is some fine shit. But Sonic's control makes them a little boring to navigate, and sometimes, not often, but sometimes, mandatory game events that further the story involve you having to do certain things within the hub world instead of just letting you progress to the next stage, which is a little annoying. But the biggest problem with this game's structure are the Sun and Moon medals. Every time you approach a new stage in the game, you're greeted with a roadblock that asks you to collect a certain amount of Sun and Moon medals to progress. This one element absolutely kills the game's pacing at certain points, as you're suddenly forced on a scavenger hunt across the hub worlds and previous stages to meet the quota for this totally needless roadblock. Sonic Colors. This game progresses on a stage-to-stage basis, with each act in each individual world represented on a world map screen. Every few stages you get a cutscene that furthers the story in some way. It's essentially the same as Adventure 2, minus the multiple stories, and generally I just think it's inferior. The game immediately starts you out in the first level. No story or context whatsoever because that's how the classics did it, I guess. You know, except for the best one. Immediately you're asking questions. Where am I? Why am I here? What am I doing? And you don't get an answer to any of these until you're 2 levels in. Having a world map suddenly pop up on screen during the campaign after beating a level creates a really tacky seam in the presentation. The cutscenes are somewhat infrequent, only showing up every so often instead of after every level. I don't mind this too much, but the cutscenes themselves do absolutely nothing for this game. Not only do they rarely create any drive or motivation for beating the next level or the next boss, mostly because they're more concerned with tickling your funny bone with this Oscar-worthy comedic dialogue, but they're completely incongruous with the actual gameplay. A commonly cited example is this scene where Eggman uses the power of the Wisps to shoot his mind control beam at Tails. Instead of doing the obvious thing and following this up with a boss fight where you fight Tails with some kind of Frenzy Wisp power-up or something, the scene instead ends with the mind control beam running out, Tails going back to normal, Eggman summoning a giant spaceship with a stupid face on it out of nowhere, and the earth-shattering revelation that Eggman was up to no good, followed by a boss fight with that spaceship. What was the point of any of that? That's like if a Mario game began with Bowser trying to kidnap Peach, but Peach kicks him in the balls and runs away, and all of a sudden you have to fight a Titan. It's pointless and has no bearing on the gameplay, so why is it there? Sonic Generations. The game yet again starts you off immediately in the first level without any establishment of what's going on. After you beat the first stage, you get treated to a cutscene that sets up the story of the game, which ends with Sonic being transported into a white void. This white void acts as a hub area that accommodates all the levels in the game. The levels are split up into 3 eras: Classic, Dreamcast, and Modern. There are 3 levels in each era, all with 2 acts. When you beat all of them, you come up to a literal roadblock where the boss you need to beat to complete the area is locked away and can't be accessed. To unlock it, you need to gather 3 keys. You get these 3 keys by playing one of the extra missions littered throughout each level. Once you have all of them, you can unlock the boss fight, beat him, and then move on to the next era of the game. It's not good when a game this short resorts to roadblocks in order to fill out its runtime. I find it hinders the pace of the gameplay when every 3 levels I'm forced to play a snippet of extra content just to continue along. I don't find many of the extra missions all that fun because most of the designs aren't that interesting, and some of them really bring out the worst in modern Sonic's control. The game does an abysmal job contextualizing its levels or giving the player any drive to move forward. It never punctuates its levels with any story beats to incentivize your progression. They're just levels for levels' sake. So that pretty much takes care of all the more fundamental game design elements I wanted to cover. Now let's move on to the final category I want to discuss: spectacle.
So hard to chew. My love to
This is an element of the Sonic series I often see people refer to as an extraneous and even detrimental accessory that the series can't help but cling to. But if you ask me, it couldn't be more essential. If you're unfamiliar with the term spectacle in relation to Sonic, I'll give you a brief rundown. It refers to the smoke and mirrors that decorate the path you're taken through as you play the game. For instance, scaling down the skyscraper in Speed Highway of Adventure 1, or the Mark Speed section at the end of Kingdom Valley in Sonic 06. Moments of awe and excitement with striking visuals, larger-than-life scenarios, and concepts that capture your imagination. These are moments that are littered throughout many Sonic games and make up for what I think is kind of an unsung winning streak for the series. They're some of the most memorable parts of the games they're from, and give even the most contemptible of installments a spark of style and charm. A lot of people don't like Sonic and the Black Knight, but I don't know, if you ask me, any game with a level that has Sonic run headfirst into a valley of active volcanoes then uses a slab of rock to surf on a stream of lava is definitely doing something right. People will argue that this element of the franchise does nothing but distract from the gameplay and encourages it to be a shallow style over substance experience. That is a worst-case scenario, I will grant you, but I don't think that warrants turning Sonic into a Mario-esque pure video game with no added spice or flavor. Sonic's very existence is a novelty, made to put on a show to draw the ire of passers-by from the competition. If he were to ignore this part of himself, he would be ignoring what made him successful in the first place. Ever since Sonic 1, spectacle has been Sonic's bread and butter in drawing the player in and captivating them. Imagine playing Green Hill for the first time again, and after stumbling your way through, you come up to that tube in the hill that sucks you in, launching you off a ramp into the air. It may not look like much now, but to a 7-year-old in 1991 who'd been raised on Nintendo games, it's a moment of thrill, that burst of speed and the sudden release at the end. They'd never seen anything like that in a video game. So I think spectacle is an integral part of Sonic's appeal, but it's important that that spectacle facilitates gameplay. For an example that makes more evident use of the mechanics, what about the beginning of Chemical Plant Act 2 in Sonic 2? At this point in the game, you may have fumbled around with the controls enough to discover that rolling downhill allows you to build up speed. You approach the slope, start rolling, and suddenly you're sent hurtling down this road, accelerating as you go, only to be flung upwards a considerable height, giving you a chance to access a route you wouldn't normally be able to had you not rolled down the slope. An intuitive gameplay mechanic through skillful use, making way for an exciting, cool-looking set piece that feels fun and satisfying. This is what Sonic fans refer to as speed as reward, which is an apt way of putting it, but I think it's important to remember that speed in and of itself is a spectacle. If it wasn't, Sonic wouldn't have been so marketable back in the day. Okay, so you get it. So how do the adventure games and the boost games go about presenting an exciting scenario that complements their design? On a cosmetic level, I think the adventure games are quite solid in this regard, and I'll talk about why later. But in terms of how they contribute to the gameplay, they leave a lot to be desired. Not only does the sense of spectacle in these games not complement the game's mechanics in any way, they actively distract from them. Sure, on a cosmetic level, many of the set pieces are all distinct from each other and memorable in their own right, some of the best in the series in fact, but they classify as spectacle in the most superficial way possible, as it's all about being visually appealing and not imparting any interactivity to make you feel like you're the one responsible for its visual appeal. As I said before, this application of spectacle is an immense hindrance on the gameplay because it tends to control how often you're in control and how the levels are designed. Anytime you play through any one of these stages, you're forced through these sections of complete non-gameplay that only serve to get less and less impressive the more you see them because they have no substance. Now, some of these set pieces do manage to add in a meaningful way, like the snowboarding sequence at the beginning of City Escape or the aforementioned skyscraper sequence in Speed Highway. Sure, they're a little incongruous in that they don't really utilize the core mechanics to achieve their goal, but they're at least interactive. They present you with a gameplay mechanic disguised as a cinematic moment, but for the most part, whenever these games try to be cinematic, it's at a detriment to their design. The boost games are a step in the right direction in this regard, but I feel could still be improved. More than any 3D Sonic playstyle, the boost gameplay really does manage to capture the inherent coolness of the character because the spectacle of his speed had finally become interactive. The Sonic you saw in all of the cutscenes, cinematics, and other supplemental materials such as movies and TV shows, where he was caught in all of these high-speed chases chases, outwitting his adversaries with feats of speed and athleticism, was the Sonic you were playing as. Sonic is a force of nature, it's a theme of the series, and never before had that felt so literal in terms of gameplay than in the Boost games. It even manages to keep its mechanics consistent when introducing special scenarios. Take for instance Sonic Generations. Generations actually brought back the snowboarding sequence and the skyscraper sequence from their respective levels, and executed them in a way that provided a sense of spectacle while also complementing the mechanics. On the skyscraper, you weren't just suddenly shifted into a new control scheme to compensate this one section. You were still boosting and quick-stepping, same as before, but here it's facilitating a special moment. In the snowboard section, it was more than just a linear slope down San Francisco just meant to look cool as opposed to challenge you. You could use the boost on the snowboard, and it was filled with alternate routes and shortcuts that you could only reach with proper coordination of the boost and timing of your trick jumps. So it would seem like the Boost games have this spectacle thing pretty much down pat. But my problem with them again just lies in how one note they are. The Boost gameplay excels in giving you a Sonic that free runs at the speed of sound, constantly at the height of his capabilities. But that's the problem, it's constant. While Sonic's speed in these games is a novel spectacle to behold, it nevertheless becomes tiresome when it's the only thing at play level after level. Seeing Sonic run on water was really cool the first time, but when that happens again and again in the preceding levels, it starts to lose that initial spark. It also adds to the feeling of every level being too similar. To quote Shay-Mei, when the entire game is spent going at the speed of sound ceases to become valuable. A big theme of the Boost gameplay is power, and that's where the spectacle comes from. Having this character flex his wealth of ability, bulldozing through a veritable barricade of adversity and making great mileage while doing it. And while that is empowering, it has no sense of pathos. Empowerment is one of Sonic's greatest strengths, but another equally great one is his dramatic appeal. The trilogy of games, plus CD, that this franchise was founded on ran on the theme of nature versus technology. This little woodland creature with extraordinary abilities standing up for his home, friends, and overall way of life, taking on this oppressive force of technology that threatens to take over his world. It's this element of emotional appeal that makes the Sonic franchise at its best and most realized so engaging. So the spectacle of Sonic's gameplay not only needs to come from a sense of power, it also has to come from a sense of drama. An important element of drama is the idea of triumph. Good triumphs over evil, an individual through perseverance triumphs over a challenge, etc. We like to see our heroes put through great stress and anguish because it makes their triumph that much more earned. A triumph is only as good as the challenge that precedes it. Whenever you see Sonic do what he does in these games, there's never a moment of weakness, he never appears challenged or humbled, and it serves to make the spectacle of his speed feel mundane. He's not pushing his limits to overcome the challenges he's facing, he's more or less just saying, look what I can do. This is a result of the level environments and the enemies in them feeling very secondary in this playstyle's priorities. While visually distinct, none of them have any real mechanical or dramatic identity that bolsters them as a force of their own to combat Sonic. Most of the time they just take a backseat to his high-speed acrobatics. A lot of the set pieces in the adventure games may have boiled down to non-gameplay sequences, but they at least managed to give each individual level a sense of dramatic presence, like there were genuine distinct environments with some life and energy that countered Sonic's in some way, instead of just being a picturesque backdrop for him to run through. One example that sticks out to me. I'm quite fond of the tornado sequence in Windy Valley of Sonic Adventure 1. You know how it goes, it's the transitional point between the first half of the level and the second half. The level starts off with you hopping around these sparse canyons adrift in the sky, occasionally being carried along by these wind currents. Soon you come to a point where Sonic is suddenly sucked into a tornado, leading into a sequence where he has to scale the surrounding environment to escape. It's laughably unrealistic, but a really likable concept for a level section. Two things I like about this section. The first is the sense of character it invokes in the overall environment. Having the gusts of wind that create paths for Sonic to help him through the first section, only to be violently thrust into a tornado a few seconds later, gives the environment this deceptive undertone. At first the wind is your friend, a breezy blanket for Sonic to ride on buoyantly. Just cut loose, relax, it's okay, I got you. Hell, Takal even points that out herself.
The wind is making an invisible path. Don't be afraid. Go through the gate.
But before you know it, the wind suddenly turns on you. For a moment, Sonic is powerless and completely at the mercy of this hostile force of nature, as if to say, this is my domain. I'm the one in control, not you. The way it switches in practically an instant makes the environment feel autonomous. It doesn't just feel like it was built for Sonic. It's a creature of chaos that does whatever it wants when it wants, just like Sonic himself. The other thing I like is how this section ties the narrative of the level together as a perilous vignette that Sonic comes out of looking stronger by the end. When the level starts off, the visual of the vast skies from which the green mountains you're traversing are suspended over, accompanied by the pastoral yet also spirited theme song, serve to give this sequence a liberated, carefree essence. This is a peaceful place where Sonic can just cut loose and let both his feet and the wind carry him to his heart's content. Then a sudden storm breaks the silence and Sonic is carried into the tornado. The music shifts from a calm, measured ballad to a tense, pulsating, up-tempo rhythm that perfectly matches the sight of this tornado howling viciously around you. Everything about this moment feels urgent. Sonic needs to move fast and get out ASAP. 1 second wasted and he could end up torn to shreds and left in the afterbreeze. At least that's how I felt when I first played it. And when you eventually do escape, you're flung even further up in the air, reaching new heights only to hit the levitated ground running as Sonic powers through highways that twist and turn. The music here, a remix of Green Grove from Sonic 3D Blast, sells this as a liberating, energized, and indeed triumphant moment. Sonic looks much stronger and more impressive when he manages to succeed in a situation where he's especially vulnerable, like, well, being sucked into a giant tornado. One thing of particular note in this theme song are the trumpets at the very beginning that really announce its presence right out of the gate and immediately grab your ear. Their placement at the beginning of this third section really worked to personify Sonic's grand prevail here, almost like a victory fanfare, as if to say, "Congratulations, you cheated death, you should be proud." As a side note, modern Sonic team, take notes. This is how you do an homage, by taking the original material and putting a spin on it that gives it new life, not just leeching off the original's appeal for all it's worth. This Green Grove remix and its usage in the game turns the original soundtrack from a blissful, happy soundtrack to a leisurely stroll through the forest, to a propulsive, heroic companion piece to Sonic's revelry as he treks through the skies. I'd take this kind of stuff over a million sandy green hills any day. And look, when it's all said and done, this all sounds very interpretive and silly, I know, but the thing to take from this is that it's important that Sonic feels powerful, but he also needs to feel vulnerable to forces outside of himself. It gives way to more exciting scenarios, and it gives his strength more impact when we see him struggle. To me, Sonic will always be more badass, getting sucked into a giant tornado and coming out alive the other end, than boosting through another 1,000,001 of Eggman's useless robots. Okay, so I think I've pretty much covered everything I wanted to. To sum it all up, between these two playstyles, I think the strengths we can take away from them are as follows. The adventure style has comfortable controls, its level design is relatively open, offering free range of movement and you can tackle it at your own pace, and its spectacle presents exciting, dramatic scenarios and premises that make Sonic vulnerable and give him a sense of pathos. The boost gameplay has solid speed-based mechanics, its linear level design is ideal for creating interactive set pieces, and the spectacle excels in empowering you through the power of Sonic's speed. So if we were to put all of these strengths into one game, what would we have? Controls that compensate for both fast and slow movement, relatively open level design that lets you indulge, and is also fully 3D, occasionally making way for fast-paced, linear sequences that can focus on delivering interactive set pieces that present exciting scenarios, with a Sonic that is empowering but not invincible. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, those basic outlines sound like the making of a pretty solid Sonic game. I mean, there's obviously no way to know how good it would be just by talking about it, but making the best Sonic game wasn't really my goal with this video. It was to show that good games are made with good ideas that are well conceived, and both these styles have their fair share of those. I like to think that they're the missing pieces of each other's other half of the puzzle. Neither one is perfect, and neither one should be completely denounced in favor of the other, because they're both flawed and they're both also good in their own ways. And I think this also applies to the Sonic franchise as a whole. For the longest time, the Sonic franchise has been constantly throwing out ideas with every subsequent game for one reason or another, and as a result, it's become so creatively bankrupt. I can't count the amount of things I think Sonic 06 had going for it that at this point have just become lost to time. Yes, it's important to realize when something doesn't work, but there are more constructive ways of remedying it than just scrapping it altogether. But this is a common practice when it comes to the Sonic series. It doesn't learn from its mistakes, it just avoids them. I mean, it's good to see that with Sonic Forces, Sonic Team to some extent still has their attitude of throwing caution to the wind and implementing some foreign concept to the franchise that offers up a well of potential. Let's just hope this time around they have the developing chops to pull it off. I don't want this to be another game where I can only think about what it could have been. And even if that does happen and Sonic Forces tanks, don't rule out this new idea as yet another intangible pipe dream beyond the scope of this franchise, because as with a lot of other scrapped ideas from previous games, that's simply not true. So, Sonic Team, again in the non-existent reality where you're actually watching this, whenever a light bulb goes off in your head and you have some wild, crazy idea for the next Sonic game, maybe next time leave it on for a while, because you can only turn off so many before you're left stumbling in the dark.